There we go. Now we'll come up hopefully very soon. Can you refresh? Good to go.
Awesome, thank you.
Pop on whatever slide.
Hi everybody. Can I have your attention? I'm Megan Thomas, hopefully you remember me from Foundation Week. I just want to start, before we start this session formally, I actually just want to ask a few questions
And just make it.
from this group about how much you know about the new MD. Does anybody who knows what's going to change in the MD degree versus your MBBS honours degree? Does anybody know? Do you think BMed honours is still relevant in the new MD? Who thinks will no longer be BMed honours? Hands up. Who thinks will still be BMed honours? Okay, pretty good job. It will still be BMed honours. Okay, so I just want to really quickly go over what will be changing in the new MD so that you feel armed and comfortable with the changes going forward, so that you all know how your degree is given to those students. So in the new MD, there's really three major changes. In Year 3, there's an introduction of an online statistical module, and you guys already have that resource in Moodle. Okay, so you guys have got access to the exact same resource that the new MD students have access to in Year 3. Okay, so the idea will be eventually that students will learn it in Year 3 and then you can just go back and access that information when they get up to BMed honours or up to Year 5 of the MD degree. Okay, so you actually already have the benefit of that new material available to you. The other two changes are both in Year 5, and one of those changes is an enhanced patient safety module, and the other change is the replacement of the elective rotation with a unit that we're broadly calling a scholarly intensive placement. That scholarly intensive placement will just be really a little snapshot, so it could be students doing a taster of research, so just working into a tiny little proportion of a larger research project. Students might do a quality or safety audit in the hospital, they might write a literature review, they might pull out go and work in one of the units in the hospital and basically review some disease or treatment that you don't currently cover in the current medical curriculum. The other thing that they might do is develop new education materials. So materials for other students, patient information sheets, something like that. So there'll be like a research stream, a professional practice stream, which will be all the hospital quality safety stuff, and an education stream. What I really want to get across to you guys though, is that new unit in Year 5, for any students who do research in that new unit, that is not going to come anywhere near close to equating what you're doing during BMed honours. Okay? You're doing a full year of research. You've already been in it for how many weeks now? How many weeks in are we? I don't know what date it is. Must be nearly a month in already, are we? Yeah, so the time that you've spent is already most of what those students will have done in their SIP. So just a tiny, they will do a tiny taster of research. You guys are getting a really proper research experience in your honours year. This BMed honours enables you to go on and do a PhD if you should want to in the future. And whereas the new unit, the new MD won't be enough for students to go on and do a PhD. They will still need to do honours or publish a first author paper or something like that to go on to do a PhD. Okay, so that's just a really quick overview. I just wanted to really to make sure that you all realise that the honours will still be a really big, important thing for anybody who really wants to do research in the new MD. Okay, so we're going to go, I'm going to start talking.
I'm just going to move that there so you can talk towards the computer.
Okay. Oh, I might want to use the...
Yeah, I was just going to pop in the chair just so you can reach it.
Can I do it here? 'Cause I've got
Yeah, just so
that
long
back.
as you talk towards it.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm going to stand here and not walk around as much, which is very difficult for me, I have to say. Okay, so I'm going to give you an overview of the things that you want to think about when you're writing your literature review. And I'll do a really quick overview of your oral presentation at the end, but the main focus of this is on the literature review. So really what I talk about is really fundamental things to think about when you're writing your literature review. Firstly, know the deadline. Yeah? You've got hardly any deadlines this year, so make sure that you know exactly when that literature review is due, and make sure that you plan to have that written well in advance of that deadline. Read the marking criteria. So go into your course guide and really look at the background information that we give you about, there's like about a page that talks about how to structure your literature review, and then there's the marking criteria that your examiners will be marking on. It's worth 75% of Med 4301, which is your 12-point unit. When you're preparing for the literature review, hopefully at the moment you've already been reading lots of research papers. So when you read those papers, make sure that you take really good notes, particularly make notes about the methods and make notes about the results that they found in those papers. Put the author and the year that it was published. And sometimes you'll often find that you end up having several publications from the same first author. So you might want to put a couple of the authors in when you're making notes about these papers, so you don't have to go back and reread the entire paper again to figure out whether it was the one they published in May or the one they published in September. And enter them in EndNote as you go. This will save you an enormous amount of time later. As soon as you get a PDF, enter it into EndNote, or automatically download it into EndNote. Really important that you do actually read the paper, okay? Because lots of people will misquote themselves, or they'll say things a little bit not quite right, and you'll be amazed at how many times that happens. You know, I've looked at an abstract, read an abstract for a paper, gone, that's fantastic, I'm writing a grant application, I've just found a paper that provides exactly the supportive evidence that I want. They say in the abstract that this something caused something else to go up, and I've whipped through the results section to have a look, and actually it caused that thing to go down. But in the abstract, they said it went up. Okay, so people, you often find mistakes that go up. Don't just believe what it says in the abstract, actually read the paper. So as I've said, you need to be really well prepared in advance, because you want your supervisor to give you good quality feedback. They're not going to be able to give you good quality feedback if you only give it to them the night before it's due. You really need to get that to them weeks beforehand, and ideally start to feed parts, sections of your literature review to them as you go, so that you know you're on the right track. Discuss the timing with your supervisors, so make sure that you make a really detailed plan with the supervisor. When do they want to receive what sections of the literature review? Know when they're going away for holidays. Are they taking extra time off after Easter, or are they going to only take the stat days? Also, test your conversion to PDF, because the moment you put images and diagrams in the literature review, there's bound to be problems when you convert to PDF. So as an example, your unit guide, Kim emailed out the unit guide, the course guide, to all of your supervisors, and it was only a few days later that I went to have a look at that PDF, and we discovered the whole second half of the PDF had disappeared, hadn't converted across from the Word document. Okay, so that happens really easily. So make sure that you check that final PDF before you upload it. So in the literature review, hopefully you've already read your guidelines in the course guide. You'll see that you can do a systematic review if you want. How many supervisors have talked to them about doing a systematic review rather than a standard literature review? Yep, 1, 2. Anybody else? Hands? 3? Okay, so there's actually some really good resources on the library site about how to write a literature review, and there's a link on the or maybe I've got it in the later slide. There's a link on the library site that takes you to an Alexandria resource that gives you much more detailed assistance in how to write a systematic review. So I'm not going to go over that today. I'm really going to focus on a more standard style literature review. If you do write, for those of you who are writing a systematic review, it's really important. Often that systematic review doesn't cover the entire background. So if you're doing a systematic review, you might need either some additional written material at the start of the literature review or at the end of the literature review to make sure that it directly links to your aims and hypotheses. Okay, so really make sure that you do that. Otherwise, you'll definitely lose marks when it comes to being examined. Okay, no extensions. We're really strict. In fact, the whole university is really strict on giving extensions. BMSI Honours is your only project. You're meant to be devoting 48 hours every week on your BMSI Honours project. Okay, so there's absolutely no excuses for not being able to meet that deadline. The only thing that we accept excuses for are serious medical issues. So if you get hospitalised or an immediate family member gets hospitalised, then we might, or your supervisor gets hospitalised, then we might consider giving you an extension. But if your supervisor goes on holidays, then you should have known about that. Or they go to a conference, you should have known about that. Okay, that's not an excuse for getting, that's won't be a reason that we would accept for an extension. So by this point, hopefully you've already been thinking about the sorts of things that you will need to put in your literature review. So you should, if you haven't already, you should make a dot point outline of the major headings that you think that you'll need to put in your literature review. Think about what your main headings will be and think about what your subheadings will be. Having headings and subheadings really helps your examiners to follow the train of thought as you progress through your literature review. And set yourself a really strict timeline for completion of each portion of that lit review. Lit review should really tell a story. I always talk about that you should take a non-expert by the hand and lead them along the path. And they should know where that path is going to end before they get to the end of the literature review, okay? So it's really thinking about, and it's important that you take this to know a non-expert, okay? One of your examiners is going to be nominated by your supervisor. The other examiner will be selected from the pool of supervisors at your school. So they could be in a completely different field. They might be a scientist, like me. They might be a clinician in a completely different area. They might be a bioethicist. Okay, so they might not know anything about your particular topic that you're writing your thesis on. Okay, so you need to write it in such a way that a non-expert is going to be able to understand it. And as I said, the final destination should really be obvious before you arrive there. The language needs to be accessible and use figures, headings and subheadings to your advantage to help explain concepts. Headings, subheadings, diagram, and really clear links between each section. So usually the last sentence of a section will lead you in to the heading for the next section. Okay, should be a really logical link between each section. Keep it relevant, focused, and concise. We're talking about scientific writing, so you do need to be concise. And you might think 7,500 words is a massive amount, but you'll soon find that you get to that limit really pretty quickly, so that you'll need to go back and tighten up on your word count. This is the sort of broad structure that most literature reviews follow. We talk about it being an inverse triangle or inverse pyramid, and the idea is that you start very broad and you narrow. I'll put all of these slides up on Moodle, by the way, so you probably don't need to actually write anything down. The idea is that your topic will start broad and that you will gradually narrow that topic down until you come to your aim and your hypothesis. Okay, so they should always start with an introductory paragraph that basically summarises everything, all of the main points that you will have in the rest of the literature review. Okay, so your examiner should be able to read that first paragraph and basically know what you're going to be telling them about in the rest of the literature review. Most of the time they'll start with either a description and scale of the clinical problem or with a broad background to a broad area. Then you'll narrow to a specific area that that your thesis will be focused on. You might talk then either about what's known and what's not known, or you might talk about potential causes and what's known or not known about those causes. Finally, you'll outline the very specific evidence that will lead to your aim and hypothesis, okay? So you start with really broad. You might talk about numbers and dollar costs of a particular disease is a really common way for these things to start. Then you start to narrow it down to the particular aspect of the disease or treatment that you might be looking at. Then you talk about what we know about that area and where the gaps of knowledge are. And then you start focusing on really specific details that people have published in relation to the particular thing that you're working on. So just read this. This is an introductory paragraph to one of my past honours students. So just read this paragraph, and then I'll take you through and show you how almost every sentence of that refers to each part of that inverse triangle that I just talked about. So just take a few minutes to read that. Okay, done? All right, so now we'll talk about just show you how that introductory paragraph covers each of those main things that I had in that inverse triangle. So how does it relate to that inverse triangle? I actually talk in this one, the student talks about two different clinical problems. They talk about a really big clinical problem, preterm birth, so about 1 in every 10 women gives birth to a preterm baby. Then he narrows it down to a more specific disease, bronchopulmonary dysplasia. Okay, so he starts with a big disease, preterm birth, and then narrows it down to a consequence of that, I shouldn't say preterm birth's a disease, but of a condition, and then narrows it down to the disease of interest, which is bronchopulmonary dysplasia. The broad background is lung development. In order to understand this project, your assessor is going to need to know about the stages of lung development and what a lung should look like by normal birth and what it would look like after preterm birth. Okay, so that gives the broad background to the research area. Then he's narrowed it down to the specific thing that he wants to talk about, how assisted ventilation might contribute to this disease. Talks about what's known, so we know that assisted ventilation can injure the lungs, and we know that lung injury is associated with BPD. Then we talk about what's not known, so we know that there's an association between these two things, but we don't actually know how lung injury leads to BPD. We talk about a potential cause or mechanism, this gene called connective tissue growth factor. Briefly provide some of the most important evidence that suggests that this factor might be involved, and then list the aim for the project. Okay, so just by reading that one paragraph, the assessor already knows exactly the main topics that we're going to talk to them about in the rest of the literature review. And then finally, it's always good to finish that introductory paragraph with a statement about potential outcome. So why is it actually important to fill in this, to answer? Okay, so this is basically what I've just gone through in that introductory paragraph. So each of those points should give you the main section headings for the rest of the literature review. So for that example I just had, this student started with describing the stages of lung development, the problem of preterm birth, how respiratory support is needed for preterm babies, how respiratory support can lead to bronchopulmonary dysplasia, that ventilation-induced lung injury is probably a major contributor, and that CTGF could be the factor that leads to injury to abnormal lung development. Okay, so that one paragraph should give you all of those broad headings. Importantly, although I say we start broad and then we narrow down to a specific topic, as you narrow down, you should have more and more specific evidence in those sections. So the later sections of your literature review should have much more detail, particularly should be talking about individual methods and data in original research papers. Okay, so in those first couple of sections, you might refer to review articles because they're all things that are pretty well known. 1,000 people have written about them. But towards the end of your literature review, you should be really only referring to original research papers and really discussing what you might talk about what particular method they used, the particular details, the exact results that they found in their research paper and how that contributes to what's known and not known about your research area. In terms of broad things, try to keep abbreviations to a minimum. So you see a lot of the projects that I work on involve a lot of genes. Obviously, if one of your assessors is somebody who doesn't know much about genes and they go, oh, what is CTGF? I don't know what CTGF means. What's VPD? I don't know what VPD is. What's Philly? I don't know what Philly is. The more of those abbreviations you have, the more difficult you make life for your assessors. Sometimes your assessor might use the exact same abbreviation for a disease in their field or a treatment or something in their field. So you need to keep that in mind. So use one. Connective tissue growth factor is obviously, if you have to write that 100 times during the lit review, you have to write 100 times during the lit review, then your examiner is going to get pretty sick of reading it. Yeah, but if you only use something once or twice, if you only use an abbreviation once or twice, then there's no need to include that abbreviation. You're just making life hard for your assessor. Do include a list of abbreviations at the start of your literature review. Make a page, should be at least a page long usually, of any abbreviations that you do use in your literature review. Mostly we don't use footnotes in the type of thesis that you'll be doing here, unless you're bioethics. I think students often use footnotes, but usually in the rest of them you probably don't need footnotes. Can I see a hand? Yep.
In terms of using to start off using reviews, I think one of the library people who had a chat to us about reviews is like they're not like a tertiary type evidence a lot of the time, like the narrative reviews as opposed to systematic reviews. Are we still allowed to cite narrative reviews given that we're just kind of summarizing someone's summary?
Yeah, when you're writing something big like a thesis, then in those broad overview statements, you would often refer to a good quality review in the background, in the early parts of the background. By the time you get to the end, you should be really largely referring to a specific individual papers. But at the start, you know, I mean, when you're describing the really basic fundamental stuff about your organ of interest or your disease, then you still need to have cite some evidence for that. But often those original research articles don't, you might need to put 10 of them together to come up with, or go back 100 years, you know, to explain, to provide the evidence for something that's pretty fundamentally known. Okay, so it's no problem to have reviews, as long as you don't go overboard. You know, I wouldn't expect to probably find more than 5 reviews in an honours lit review. Glossaries, some people put in a glossary. I think most of the time it shouldn't be needed. You should always explain that in full in the text the first time you use an abbreviation. Sentence structure, really common things. You see some people writing sentences that are like 4 or 5 or 6 lines long. That should never happen. Yeah. So usually if it's any longer than 3 lines long, it's too long, separate it into 2 sentences. Avoid jargon. So I'd use an example of the sort of stuff that we do we're very guilty of, I think, in the Ritchie Centre. We do a lot of surgeries on fetal sheep, and because we're primarily scientists, not clinicians, we often refer to the person who's non-sterile and is peeling sterile things to be used for the surgeons to use. We often refer to that person as the peeler, right? Obviously, they're a theatre assistant, okay, but amongst us, we would never use theatre assistant. We would always use the peeler. We would say, where's our peeler gone? Okay, so you don't want to put jargon like that in your literature review. You want to use the proper scientific terminology for it, or terminology. Avoid ambiguous statements. Read this sentence and tell me what's wrong with it. Several things wrong with it, actually. Okay, what's wrong? Who can tell me what's wrong with it? It's a long, convoluted sentence, isn't it? For starters, it's probably too long. But secondly, this second sentence here, that, is it now showing up? So this sentence here talks about 2 different research studies with 2 different findings. And then it follows that with a sentence that says, that study suggests blah, blah, blah. You don't know from that whether they're referring to this study or this study. You know, this is probably the most common thing that we see in honours research statements is that you write a statement and you can't tell exactly what you're referring to by the sentence structure. Okay, so every sentence needs to be really clearly written. So there should be absolutely no ambiguity about exactly what you're referring to in each sentence. So this would have been better separated into 2 sentences, and that study should have clarified the former study or the latter study or the study by X person, etc. Yeah, to make it really clear what you're talking about. You will find lots of examples in the literature review where you've got conflicting data between different studies. Okay, lots of examples, and you should be thinking as you're reading those studies, what could explain those differences in findings in those studies. Often it's the experimental design itself. Avoid statements that look like holes. So this is a really common thing. The function of this is to do this, this, and this, along with other roles. Yeah, that's a red flag to Bull. That's a red flag to me as an examiner to go, what other stuff? I want to know what that other stuff is. Why didn't you tell me what that other stuff is? You didn't tell me what it is because you don't know anything about it, isn't it? Yeah, that's the way we think. So try to avoid that. There's lots of different ways that you can do that. You could say something like the main function of X is to do this, this, and this. Okay, particularly if you're in the earlier part of your literature review, you've said there the main functions. Okay, you haven't clarified every single function. You've said the main functions of this thing is to do this. The other way that you can do it is to say the main functions of this is to do this, this, and this. Several other roles have been posed, but there might be currently limited evidence to support them, and a full description is beyond the scope of this literature review. Yeah, that takes it as an examiner. That goes, oh yeah, okay, they're keeping that review targeted, focused on the thing that they want the examiner to be targeted and focused on. Yeah, I'm not getting distracted by this other stuff that the student hasn't told me. They purposely don't want me to get distracted on that stuff. Okay? Oh, spell check. It's really annoying when students submit work that looks sloppy. So really make sure that you do a spell and grammar check before you submit your literature review. Not everything, of course, gets picked up. Things like artefact versus artefact, 2 completely different meanings, but that's not going to get picked up in your spell check. You may need to explain different spelling types, who's doing projects involving molecular biology? Anybody? A few people at the back? Not many. Oh, a few. Okay, so one of the common things is, of course, depending on whether you're talking about mice, rodents, or humans, then you have different terminology based on how you should write the protein versus the gene. No, most of the clinicians who might be your assessors won't know that you write the protein differently to the way you write the gene. Okay, so you need to explain that the first time that you write it. Track changes. Now, in the good old days, we used to get copies of our drafts of our review back with red pen all over them, every page, handwritten notes all over it. But of course, now nearly everybody uses track changes. Really important. That's just too easy to just accept the changes that your supervisors have suggested. Don't just accept it. Read it. Think about why they're suggesting that you change something or add something or delete something. Why are they doing that? Because that's how you learn to write scientifically, by thinking about what they're asking you to do. Okay, so don't just blindly accept their track changes. And often we'll put comments. Instead of using the comment box, we'll put comments in there. And if you just accept it, then the examiner's going to know your supervisor wrote that, not you. The library also has lots of information, as you said, on how to write literature reviews or other types of scientific or medical writing. Referencing, so you should reference every specific statement. Okay, so this is what we'll talk about before. Review articles are okay for really broad statements, but once you get down to specific statements, you need to include a reference. Don't include 10 references unless you're perhaps talking about a cancer that can occur in 10 different organs, then you might have 10 different references, but that would be probably about the only time that you would do that. Yeah, so as long as you make it clear, usually if it's every single sentence, then yeah, it can be a bit of overkill. But as long as it's really clear that you're still referring to the same sentence. So often you'll put it in the first sentence that you refer to that article. Then the next sentence might be in that study they also showed. And then the final study, in addition, blah, 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 and then reference them again. As I said, read each paper in full and check the details. You'll be really amazed at how many people state their own findings incorrectly, as well as stating other people's findings incorrectly. So make sure you go back to those original articles.
I was just wondering, if you're saying that multiple studies have said this, would you then be all right to put in quite a few?
Yeah, I would normally put in the most important ones.
Okay.
So you might easily find 10 or 20 studies that have found the same thing. I would choose the most important ones relevant to your topic, or the biggest ones in the area, maybe the first ones that found it. So really think about the most important, most relevant ones to your and cite those ones. Now, if you know who one of your examiners is going to be and they're also publishing in the area, then it also can pay sometimes to cite them. Reference as you go using EndNote, because it will save you an enormous amount of time. Do not leave EndNote till the last second. And also set up your headings using table of contents as you go along as well. If you don't really know how to do that, there's plenty of good online resources about how to arrange a table of contents. Again, much easier if you start that when you start writing rather than leaving it till the very end. You'll find loads of discrepancies in the literature, loads of them. Okay, that's okay. That's what science is all about, is trying to figure out which of those answers is right. Okay, so where discrepancies exist, you can raise them, and if appropriate, discuss potential reasons for those discrepancies. Figures, you can definitely use figures you find on the internet, figures in other papers, figures in review articles. You can use those in a literature review. It's a really good idea to include figures. So it's really boring reading 7,500 words of pure text. It's much better to break that up with some images that help to summarise some of that information. But you must reference that original source. So, for example, you might have a figure and it was taken from Wallace et al. Or if you modify it, then you would say modified from Wallace et al., something like that. Your figures should have a figure title. Usually we would put that in bold. So you should have a figure title in bold and a figure legend. Okay, so the figure title summarises what's in your figure, and the legend should describe all the detailed stuff pertinent to that figure. So particularly if you've got things like arrows, numbers, etc., that's not really obvious, then you need to actually highlight what those are referring to, and particularly if you have abbreviations in there. Even if you've already described what those abbreviations are in the rest of the text, you should describe. The figure itself should stand alone, okay? So you should include the full word in there as well as the abbreviation. No, the figure legends aren't included in the word count. Good question. References, there is no single set number of references that you should have. I would say, because that's going to vary depending on the field. Some fields is actually might be very new field that you're working on. There might be hardly any specific references in the area. So I would be, if there was fewer than 50 references in the literature, I'd start to go, gee, it doesn't look like they've read very widely. And if there was more than 120 or 150, then I'd start to go, I think they've probably over-referenced. I'm a bit overboard here, trying to show how much they've read. Of course you would have read well over 100 papers by the time you write a literature review. You don't need to cite every single one. Maximum word limit, 7,500 words, that's maximum, no plus 10%. Okay, in science, when we submit grants, conference abstracts, etc., lots of journal articles have firm word counts. Okay, so you have a firm word count for your literature review and thesis, absolute maximum of 7,500 words. That excludes all of these things that's listed in your course guide, and actually we've increased this year to a 3-page research outline. But your headings and your in-text citations are included in your word count. Okay, so that means when you're referencing, it's best to use a number-style referencing system rather than Wallace et al. 2015. Yeah, it's better to say have reference 5, reference number 10. Okay, that will help reduce your word count. Your research proposal at the end, this is not included in your word count, and this is to give, I should also say your aim and hypothesis should appear at the end of your literature review. Okay, so your literature review should lead directly into your aim and hypothesis or research question, and then you attach a research proposal, which is how you're going to address that aim and hypothesis. It's a maximum of 3 pages, and it's meant to be a detailed and feasible plan for completion of your research project during the year, during the honours year. Okay, so it should include things, you might need a paragraph to justify your experimental design. It probably should include an ethics statement. Lots of you still won't have the ethics approved yet. Just say this project has been submitted to this ethics committee or will be submitted to this ethics committee. Then a brief overview of the experimental design. What are the groups, largely groups or N numbers that you're looking at? What treatments or inclusion-exclusion criteria? So what are all your comparisons going to be? Timeline figures can often help, particularly if you're doing a laboratory-style project where you might do something on day 1, do something else on day 3 or hour 3, etc. So you might sometimes just a timeline for your research proposal helps. And what parameters you're going to analyse and how you're going to analyse them and what statistics you're going to use. All of that information should be included in that maximum 3-page research proposal. Your literature review will automatically go to Turnitin when you upload it for assessment. You won't get to see the report back on Turnitin before you upload it. Okay, so that's a relatively new university guideline. But for any students at the university at this level, you don't get to see the feedback. Okay, so the way to avoid matches in Turnitin is never copy anything word for word. Always write it in your own words. And use EndNote. So some of the other citation systems actually, if you use EndNote, your reference list at the end of your literature review shouldn't get included in the Turnitin match. If you use another matching program, sometimes it picks up all your references as a match and comes back at a 50 or 60% match rate. Obviously, I'll figure that out, but I'll have some alarm bells going on beforehand. The sorts of matches I'm not too worried about, so we'll often get matches to the table of contents because if you're a successive honours student in the same research laboratory, then of course your table of contents from year to year is often fairly similar structure, often has the same headings. So the table of contents often come up as a match. Definitions often come up as a match. Use quotes. Okay, if you use a quote, it's perfectly okay to define disease. So for example, hypertension, you should define hypertension, then you can use a direct quote from, the American Cardiac Society or something about what the definition of hypertension is, but use it in quotes. Obviously, you can't change a definition too much, the wording of it, without actually changing the definition itself. And ethics statements often also come up as a match in Turnitin. So those things I'll look at, and anything that comes up with a high match, I'll look and see whether or not I'm concerned about it. The sort of things I'm probably not concerned about is if I see 1 or 2 words at a time. This is probably getting a little bit, some of these things are getting a little bit high. But, you know, it's common to see words like this. I'm not that worried about it. If I see something like this, I'm going to be really worried about it. Even if I see 1 of those or 2 of those, then obviously I'm going to get worried about the amount of matching that's occurring. Examiners, as I said, 1 is nominated by your supervisor. It's not necessary, it doesn't have to be a clinician, and 1's nominated by the coordinator of your BMed Scions cohort. So either the SCS coordinator, CCS coordinator, School of Public Health, or me for all the students who are at all the other sites. And your supervisor has or will be asked to examine the literature review from another student in your cohort. It's nearly always the same examiners. Usually the same person examines your literature review and your final thesis. Okay, so unless suddenly they get sick or something happens during the year, those examiners will be the same people. Okay, just really quickly, I don't want to talk too much about the oral presentation because I think you guys you always give really fantastic oral presentations. So I'm just going to really quickly go through your first departmental oral presentation as well. So the oral presentation, quickly, it's a 10-minute oral and 5 minutes questions. We expect you to be really strictly adhere to that time. You shouldn't go over 10 minutes. And if you do, the person who's chairing the session might cut you off at 10 minutes. Okay, so don't think that you can talk for 11 minutes. You shouldn't be allowed to talk for 11. Usually that means it's only 10 or 15 slides. Again, look at the marking guidelines in the course, in the honours guide, and think about all the points that you're going to be assessed on. You don't need to include very many references in your oral presentation. You might include, in a slide that maybe has 4 points like this, you might only include 1 or 2 references on that slide. Often you'll have slides. If it's broad information, often you don't have any references at all. Less is more. I've put on these slides about the literature review, I've put lots of text. If I was giving a scientific talk, I would have nowhere near that amount of text on my slides. I've just done that so that you don't have to go and listen to, if you want to quickly remind yourself something I said in this session, you can just look back at the slides. You don't need to go back and listen to me speak again. Okay, so I put way more information on these slides than I normally would in a separate scientific presentation. Again, you're going to take the audience by the hand. Okay, so keep it really simple. Use prompts, but the prompts on their own need to make sense to more than just you. Okay, so don't just put a word like prompts, which is completely meaningless. Put it in a little bit more context. And again, make sure that you've got a really good link from one slide to the next slide. Diagrams help, particularly when you're talking about your experimental design or treatment groups or timeline for your experiments. Then having diagrams showing what you're going to do and when you're going to do it can really help. Broadly, in the first departmental oral presentation, you're telling the audience what you plan to do during your honours year. In the second departmental oral, you're telling them what you did do during your honours year. So this is, your first departmental oral is going to be primarily background. So justifying the need for the experiment. So about 60% background, then your aims and hypothesis or research question. Then usually it's about 40% the proposed methodology that you're going to use to address your research question. If you're doing stats, you really need to include the stats as a slide in your oral. Always try to finish up with an expected outcomes statement. So bring it back to the big picture in your and have some backup slides. It's always great when students have pre-prepared slides in case they get asked a question on a particular thing. Okay, so always prepare some backup slides that might help you to answer a question. No need to include a slide that lists all the references that you've used in your talk. Common mistakes. Too fast, people get up there and they're really nervous and they speak really quickly and you can't separate any words. Very common. Too quietly, you don't know, I'm really nervous. Speak really quietly and nobody can hear me. Well, practiced it 100 times and they're really bored with it and so they speak in a really monotonous tone. Yeah? All three things really common. If you're not enthusiastic about your talk, nobody else is going to be enthusiastic about your project. Okay, so try to convey that enthusiasm when you're giving your talk. Have a little bit of fluctuation in your voice. Ideally not too much fluctuation, not too fast, not too slow, not too quiet. Again, too much information. So even this, I would say, is probably too much text on a slide for a departmental oral presentation. And it's pretty boring, no pictures. Yeah, if you're going to have a picture on there, it needs to be relevant, of course. Not pointing, so often we'll see people talk about a slide and they'll wave their arms around, or they'll get their pointer and they go this, and they whiz it around, and you've got absolutely no idea what they're pointing to. Okay, so you want to keep the audience engaged where you're up to on the slide. Some people will be listening to you, some people will be reading the slides. Often people aren't doing both. So you want to either keep their attention, keep them focused by animating your slides. So you might only pop up 1 or 2 pieces of text at a time so that they're following what you're talking about. If you're using a pointer, then make sure you do that really slowly so that they can see exactly what you're pointing at. Often, because you're pretty nervous, your pointer goes like this, so use your second hand to balance your hand, okay, so that you can keep that pointer pointing at the things you actually want it to and not whizzing all over the slide. The other common thing, people use words that you only ever write and you wouldn't normally say. So keep it conversational. Your oral presentation should be much more conversational than your literature review will be. And try to avoid reading directly from your notes. Practice out loud and time yourself several times before you get into that final presentation. Questions. When it comes to question time, so the other common thing is that students often are scared to say that they don't know the answer, and they'll blurt out an answer and it's completely wrong. Okay, so in the first departmental oral, often we're asking you a question because we want to test your knowledge. Okay, so often we know the answer to a question that we ask in that first departmental oral presentation, and we want to know if you know the answer to that question. So if you blurt out something because you're not really sure what the answer is, and you get it wrong, you're going to lose marks. If instead you say, that's a good question, I don't know. It might be this. Yeah? But it's okay to say, I don't know, in an honest presentation because you're trying to answer a question that we don't know the answer to. Okay? As scientists, we're used to acknowledging where the limits of knowledge are. And you've only just started your honours. Yeah? So we don't expect you to know absolutely everything by this stage, but take a moment to think about what they've asked you and then answer it correctly if you know the answer. And if you don't know the answer, it's perfectly okay to say, oh, good question, actually, I don't know that. I might come and speak to you afterwards, or I'll look that up when I leave, okay? Or, I don't know, actually, I'm not sure that anybody knows. Okay, so lots of different ways to answer those questions. As I said, prepare backup slides and think in advance about what they might ask you. Ask your supervisors what they think you might get asked. Usually if I'm with my students, I'll go through every single slide on their talk and ask them. You should be able to ask somebody a question on every single slide that's in their presentation. So really look at each slide and think about what somebody might ask you. And again, some more, I think there's lots of information resources up on the library website now that you can use to help with this. Okay, any questions? I've just realised that I think we'll need to use the microphone for the questions for the people who aren't here. But hopefully people have understood that. Okay, you've got a question at the back?
So some projects might seem a little bit, what is the word, crass to people who are not in the field. That's it. So for example, in my study I've been talking about various things that are not. Okay. So I'm talking about like very special practices like fisting and ribbing and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
What happens if in my left review someone's reading it and they're like, this guy's just like writing about it for the sake of being funny?
So, well, one, you're writing about an honest thesis. As long as you write about that in a need, you just define it.
Yeah.
So you go, many of the practices that these people engage in, or some of the practices that these people engage in are fisting, which is blah, blah, blah. Or provide the medical terminology commonly known as fisting. You know, so you just talk about it in a clearly a medical scientific way, and that's professional. We shouldn't be ashamed to talk about those things in a professional audience. So you know, as long as you write about it professionally, there's no issues with that. Any other questions? No, I'm going to hang around till the end. I think we've now got two honour students from last year who are going to talk a little bit about their experiences writing their review. So Ben, Tiffany, who's going to go first? Ben? Okay.
Yeah, don't mind the wiggles. Beautiful. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben. I did BMed Site last year, and I've been asked to talk to you about my tips and tricks for writing lit reviews, particularly for sort of lab-based projects, purely based on my huge experience of writing one, which I'm rewriting at the moment. So take it as you will. All right, so we'll get started. So before we start, I'm going to give you a little bit of a overview of my project, and then kind of use that as we go to be a bit more specific, to build on lots of the messages that Megan actually brought up. But I'll just sort of use my project as a bit of an example. So, in fetal surgery is becoming increasingly important in obstetric medicine to treat many congenital abnormalities such as spina bifida in utero before morbidity develops. Now, the initial attempts to perform these surgeries on babies in the womb used this open approach where large incisions were made in the maternal abdomen and in the maternal uterus to directly access the fetus. However, the significant maternal morbidity associated with making these big incisions gave rise to the need for a minimally invasive approach. So this is fetoscopic surgery, and where the premise of my thesis lies. So fetoscopic surgery is a keyhole procedure that uses 3 to 4 small incisions in the abdomen and uterus to perform the surgeries under video guidance, much like they do in the abdomen. Now, operating within the amniotic space provides a whole lot of additional challenges, including the limits to the amount of space you have, the vision in the cloudy amniotic fluid, and many of the surgical tools that you can use that don't work underwater. And so we had to develop an additional procedure, partial amniotic carbon dioxide insufflation, to overcome many of these challenges. So what happens in this procedure is you drain some of the amniotic fluid out and you replace it with carbon dioxide gas to distend the uterus. And that sort of gives you a gaseous environment to perform the surgery and a little bit of extra space as well. Now, these two procedures were adopted into clinical practice. However, the concerns remain around the safety of the PACI, or this insufflation procedure. In particular, we're pretty concerned about the high solubility of carbon dioxide gas and the potential for it to dissolve into the fetal blood and cause fetal hypercapnia and acidosis. And we're also a bit concerned about the direct impact of distending the fetal membranes on the membranes themselves. And we think that this may contribute to the high rates of preterm premature rupture of membranes that we see after these procedures. So our study aimed to investigate a few things. We wanted to look at the acid base and hemodynamic effects of PACI on the sheep fetus. We also wanted to look at the effect of PACI on the fetal membranes in sheep. And we also wanted to look at the physiological and membranes effects of heating and humidifying the gas. So if we could try and potentially avoid any consequences that we might face with the standard carbon dioxide gas. So we used an experimental model in sheep. So we took pregnant ewes at 105 days gestation, I should say, which is equivalent to when we perform these surgeries in humans. We performed fetal surgery to insert, amongst many other things, a carotid artery catheter, and that let us track sort of live physiology of the fetus over our experiment. And we then had a 180-minute insufflation period. So we had a group that were insufflated with cold, dry carbon dioxide, which is the standard practice. We had our heated, humidified gas, and we had a control group that we didn't insufflate at all. After that, we performed a post-mortem analysis, and we took some of the fetal membranes for histology. Okay, so that's a little bit of an overview of my study, and we'll come back and refer to that sort of as we go. Now, writing a lit review, when you're faced with this project, is a little bit about trying to find your house on Google Maps. If you go straight to I live at Unit 7 at your very specific address, you're not going to find your house. So what you need to do is, like Megan said, is to tell a bit of a story. So you need to start off with like the country that you live in, and then the state, then the city, then the suburb, then your specific street, and then your particular house number. So for me, this was like I'm starting with the big broad field of obstetrics and gynecology, and then I was looking at like congenital abnormalities like spina bifida, then particular things like fetal surgery, endoscopic fetal surgery, then this PACI or this amniotic insufflation procedure that I sort of told you about, and then the fetal safety of PACI, and then at the very tiny specific address of my study is where your study sort of lies. And this structure I sort of refer back to a lot throughout this next 10 minutes or so, is if you can draw this pyramid out like sort of Megan had up before, it gives you the structure for your lit review. The cool thing is, as well, is your thesis is then almost exactly the opposite. So basically you start, your literature will be at the start, and then your next bit that you'll write is, we did this super specific study, these were the methods that we did, and these were the results that we got. And then it had this impact on the fetal safety of PACI, it had this impact on the application of PACI as a whole. This has this impact on endoscopic fetal surgery, and ultimately your conclusion are those big drawn out statements. So that sort of hourglass shape is how you structure first a lit review and then your thesis all together. Does that sort of make sense? Beautiful. All right. There's sort of like another bit that you come to realize a little bit later, often when you do your oral presentations, is there's this another bit that you don't necessarily put in your lit review, but you need to know a little bit about the planet that you live on. And lots of that is your methods. So lots of the questions that you'll get asked in your oral presentations is like, why do you use this animal model? Why do you use this cell model? Why do you incubate for this amount of time? Why do you do these things? Lots and lots of methodology questions. So it pays to have done a lot of reading in this sort of stuff. So if you, as I said, I'm mainly talking to you guys doing lab-based projects, but if you use a particular methodology, it pays to do some reading about people who have used similar methodologies, why they use similar methodologies, and a little bit about why you're using the particular study design that you have. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so for me, this was like, I found this amazing article that was like, why do we use sheep as a model of pregnancy? And then the very first question that I got asked at my oral presentation, which I had a slide prepared for, is like, why are you using sheep and not something else? And so it just works really nicely. All right, so the next question, and I know you guys have done lots of reading and stuff already, so hopefully this can just sort of supplement the stuff that you're doing already, but ultimately you want to find those big landmark studies to help you write your lit review, because if you miss the big landmark ones, you kind of miss the point of reviewing the literature. But then the question is kind of like, how do you find them? If you start at this is your pyramid again. If I start at fetal surgery or the fetal safety of PACI, if I start right down the bottom, how do I know what the big important studies in my field are? Well, I'll tell you. The best way to do it is, or the best way that I found anyway, is to find what I call like a recent decent review. So a big review published in a really good journal that's really high up in your pyramid. So for me, it was this one here. So this was a review published in the Journal of Medical Science in 2010. And it was basically just about fetal surgery. So your next sort of plan from here, once you've got this big review, is to find your topic. somewhere in this big review is going to be a couple of sentences that refer to your specific field. And that's normally the bit that you would have highlighted in preview or something like that and then gone to your next study, but find it. So for me, I found this little one sentence on the use of carbon dioxide to distend the uterus. And I've highlighted it there, being the good science student that I was. And then you paper jump. So you go to the reference list and you find those references that they refer to. And then this is sort of a good indication that these were important enough for the review or for the people who wrote the review to use in their literature review. And then you do it again. Then you find a review that's a little bit later, maybe not as good, and you do it again. You find your topic somewhere in there and you find the ones that repeat. And so if you can basically you need to read fewer and fewer papers because you're like, I've already read that one, and you find the ones that repeat, and then the ones that you don't need to read again, they're the important ones. They're those big ones that you should be referencing, which may have answered a couple of the questions from before, is like, do I need to reference 10 studies? Probably not. You just need to reference the one that was repeated like 5 times by the journal or the study that was published in Nature. So that's how you identify the landmark studies. Okay, that's the next step. The next question is like, how do you file all of this shit? Like you're given so much, so you get so many PDFs, and how do you file it all away? Okay, so ultimately you're going to, if you use this structure again of this little pyramid, you kind of want to avoid that from happening. So you don't want that. This is what I did. So I basically turned all of my country, state, city, suburb, all of my topics into like a folder. And every time I found a PDF, I just filed them away in that system. And it's quite nice that when you go back to write your lit review, you've kind of got a folder of all the articles that you're going to use as already there, and your literature is quite nicely organized. Now, a little trick with labeling the actual PDFs, because most of the time they'll be labeled like 479, 45, whatever. But if you relabel them the year first, which I haven't done, it pisses me off to this day. If you use year first, then the author, then the title, you also generate a timeline of your studies in that little area. So then when you go to write your lit review, you can say like, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, because you've already done that just by organizing your stuff nicely. Then, in each of these domains that you generate, this pyramid, you have sort of like a summary table, and everyone has a different way of taking notes or whatever, but I found this one the most useful, is that if you just have a table sort of set up like this with like the author and the title and then some key details, you can put that file into the other file, and then you have a summary table of all the studies in that file folder. You can use Word, EndNote, or Excel. You can use sort of whatever program you want. But having a good summary table with sort of like the useful points and the strengths and weaknesses like Megan was talking about can be really, really useful to when you go back to write your lit review at the end, you haven't just gone back to square one because you've forgotten what you read 4 weeks ago. Again, this is super personal, and if you've started something else that's working for you, like good on you, go with that. But this was just the way that I did it, and it ended up working okay. All right. If you don't use my system, these are the things that I would collect. Every time you read an important study, collect 3 things. Collect the EndNote risk file. So I'll show you how to do that, and I'm sure you guys are all over that by now. But the EndNote risk file, the PDF, which you'll sort of file away in your system, and create a row, just a quick summary in your summary table. And so basically then you sort of cover yourself for later on when you need to go and generate your references and write your lit review. Okay, just for those of you who aren't 100% sure, this is how you generate the risk file. So if you go onto PubMed, you click on the Send To button on the Citation Manager, and then you create the file, and it goes into your download section. And then if you've got EndNote open, you can click it and it just opens up the reference in your EndNote folder. It's really, as Megan said, I can't stress enough, and I'm pretty sure I bring it up in a minute, but reference as you go. You have no idea how hard it is to reference a 7,500 word document. It's probably 15,000 words by the time you've actually finished, and you go to reference it, and you've got to start again and read it through it and find the folders and find all the files to generate your EndNote library. So reference as you go, but I'll come back to that. Segue into how to tame EndNote. All right, so when, this is perfect, I already said this, reference as you go. You can do it, you can insert the references properly using EndNote like this. So there's this little bit button up here, which lets you just click on it wherever your cursor is in Word. It'll insert the reference there. But if you're a little bit worried, and my computer, I reckon, has just got mice in there on treadmills, keeping it running. It's a piece of whatever. You can, if you just go to your EndNote library and you just press Control-C or Command-C and you copy the reference, you can generate this sort of like it's like a non-formatted version of the reference, and you can just insert that into your document as you go, and therefore you don't create a massive Word document that's going to crash all the time, and you can just go back right at the end and then insert all your references if that sort of suits your computer, but it's very much up to you. Okay. Are there any questions while we're on EndNote about EndNote? Sure there are. Nope, no one is willing to say. Right, EndNote crashes. So maybe it's because none of you are up to this stage yet, but once you've got all your 150 references in EndNote, it will crash. P-value less than 0.05 is going to happen, yeah? So like, be ready for that. Basically what happens is when you create an EndNote library, it does this. So it creates one sort of file that is that's the actual EndNote library, and it creates a folder that's got all of the EndNote sort of references and the data in there. Don't touch it. Don't rename it. Don't move it. Don't put the file in the folder. Don't do anything, because if you do that, your computer will increase its risk of having a heart attack and needing a STEMI. The other thing is save every day. So this is what I did every day when I sat down to work on my lit review. I would just call it number 4, number 5, number 6. Yeah, and then if it does crash and you're like, I've lost it, you lose a day's worth of work. And I can't sort of get over how much this saved me a couple of times when you're sitting there and it goes and you lose just the morning, and you're very thankful that you save all the time. Okay. There's a couple of other points. Use summary diagrams. So if you use big, complex molecular pathways, often you can sort of get tied down into like number CP54 in the middle of this pathway, but sort of just keep in context a little bit about where you are in the study and what pathway you're sort of dealing with. The reason I say that is because often when you do a lit review, you need to be keeping things relatively simple, and you sort of need to be you need to be able to give a big, wide sentence to talk about where this cellular pathway is acting, and then maybe one focus sentence on this particular mechanism or the particular protein. So start broad and have a good summary diagram so you know where you're dealing with. So when you come to your writing, it makes a little bit more sense. The other thing is, like, so for me, I was looking at a lot of sort of surgical outcomes for the same condition. So use summary tables that can compare lots of different authors who all present the same results. And it looks really nice. This is one that I use. I'm writing at the moment, and basically it's got all the columns of different authors and all of them presented the same things, and it lets you compare everyone sort of in one big table, which is really nice. All right, so just to finish off, I want to give you two tips on writing. I don't consider myself like the biggest English freak. My spelling is shocking and my sentences can be long and convoluted. So I'll give you 2 tips. And these come from my supervisor, the lovely Brian Hodges here. And this was the email that I got when I got my first draft of my lit review back. He said, a good start, you have most of what you need, but there's 2 main issues. So the first one, as Megan said, is simplicity. Stop trying to sound smart. It just makes your writing confusing. Someone who doesn't know about Paki should be able to pick it up and understand it. Okay, so you really need to give it to your mum, give it to your brother, give it to your sister, and get them to read it and be like, do you understand this? Even if you don't know science, do you kind of follow along what I'm talking about? Is a good trick. But don't go too far. So this is a comment I got back at the conclusion of my thesis is, your conclusion is your opportunity for an impressive finale, and it felt more like a flogging with a wet lettuce. that doesn't help much. It just means that your supervisors can shred you. All right, the last one I really want to touch on, this is probably the best piece of advice that I ever got in terms of writing scientifically, and it's the difference between active and passive voice in scientific writing. And so when I got my lit review back for the first time, Ryan had gone through it, and just all through my lit review, he wrote, "The cat sat on the mat," not "the mat was sat on by the cat." The cat sat on the mat, the cat sat on the mat, the cat sat on the mat. And I was like, what the hell does this mean? Anyway, I looked it up. And basically, when you write, an author can sort of take two voices, active or passive. So the active voice emphasizes the performer. Okay, so in sentences, it's going to be performer, verb, receiver. So fetal surgeons correct congenital abnormalities. Smith et al. Investigated the relationship, or we have analysed the results. So this way of writing is much more direct, clear, and concise. And when your supervisor says to you, you need to keep your writing simple, clear, and concise, it doesn't mean rewrite it. Often it means convert it from the passive form, which I'll go through in a sec, to the active form or the active voice. The passive voice is exactly the opposite. It's receiver or product focused. So to use those same examples, it's receiver, verb, performer. So congenital abnormalities are corrected in utero by fetal surgeons. You can see that that's a much longer sentence and often uses the word by. So if that's in your lit review a lot, maybe you're using a lot of the passive voice. So instead of congenital abnormalities are corrected in utero by fetal surgeons, you would say just fetal surgeons correct congenital abnormalities in utero. Or the relationship was investigated by Smith et al. And the results have been analysed by us. So avoid that. That is all I have to say. Happy reading. I've got a few contact details there. One is mine, and one is a friend of mine who's doing MBBS PhD as well, who does lots of lab stuff. So if you have questions, email Annie about that, or I'm happy to field any that you might have as well, so either tonight or down the track. Otherwise, that's all I have. Thanks. Are there any questions now? Nope. Sweet, we'll move on.
Jeff, I don't know how Mac. Tony's talking to this.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So I can't hear it. So which one is it? Oh, yeah, 2 minutes. Oh, okay.
Okay, I think it's pretty. Oh, don't back up. Okay. Hi guys, thanks for staying so late on a Wednesday afternoon. So my name's Tiffany. I also did pre-med sci last year, but now I'm doing 5th year. And like Ben, I am very unqualified to talk to you about how to write a lit review, but hopefully some of these tips will help you. So I did a clinical project. It was a brief intervention for obesity. So I ran a clinical trial at the Alfred where we basically encouraged doctors to talk to patients with a BMI over 30 about weight management, and then followed up to see whether they went to see their GP, which they generally don't. But it was a good project. So I missed the start. I'm sorry about that. Megan might have covered this, but generally when you're writing your lit review, you go through a basic process. So you have your search strategy, which is probably, I think, the most important part of the whole process, because when you're starting and you have kind of a topic, you have a project where a supervisor is like, yeah, you should do this, like, and they've sort of got the ball rolling already for you, and you jump on and you're kind of like, oh, like, where did this come from? I think it's really important to have a really good search strategy. Write out your PICO questions from when you did them in pre-clinical or 30, or like we used to do them every year. Go back to that and have a really clear idea of what you need to be researching for. And also, another tip is to try and pick your databases and know where you need to start your searches. So different projects may require you to use different databases. So like the standard ones that most people end up using are like Medline, and because I did a clinical project, I mostly use like Medline, PubMed, Cochrane Reviews, Embase, things like that. But in your field, just ask if there are other databases which you should also be looking at. Then you do your searching and your note making and your reading, which is a very continual process, and it does take quite a long time. So it's something that you just chip away at. Like you just read a few papers. I know all of you are sitting there thinking, and then everyone had a little giggle when Megan was like, oh, like you'll definitely have read 100 papers, and everyone's sitting there being like, I'm never going to read 100 papers. But you do, because I felt like that at the start. And you just read and you read and you read. And I'm not very good at reading, so if I can do it, you can do it too. And you will read a lot. And it is important to make some notes, because if not, learn from my mistakes. You read something really interesting, and then a week later you're like, where's that paper? And then you spend the next like 2 hours trying to find that paper that you didn't make notes on. So make notes, like Ben said, as you go. Then when you actually go to start writing, then you should be at a stage where you've done a search, you've got some of your literature, you've done some reading, and you kind of know what the big ideas are and what the things that you need to be covering are. Then you need to start writing, and you put off writing because you're just dreading the thought of writing the 7,500 piece of text. And so you just don't start writing when you know you should. And so then that's when you start doing more reading, because you don't want to start writing. Then it's time to go read the actual marking criteria to see what it is that you need to be including, to make sure that when you are starting to write, you kind of know what your assessors will be looking at. Hopefully that's something that you do for all your assessments, but it's good to know right from the beginning what you need to be covering. Then you'll draft and you'll draft and you'll draft and you'll draft. And eventually you'll get to the point that either you're happy with something that you'll send to your supervisor, or you're running out of time and your supervisor needs to see something, so you need to send something to them. So you'll send it to them and you'll get some feedback. For that, my advice is to have a chat with them early, talk about their timelines. One of the hard things about BMSI is that you have very few strict deadlines, in that you have your lit review and your thesis and your oral presentations. But a lot of that work beforehand isn't on a set timeline that everyone has to follow. So you need to kind of create your own deadlines to talk to your supervisor about when they want you to send things to them, because they need to have enough time to read it and they might have a busy period coming up. So talk to them, and also talk to them about whether they want you to send them the whole thing, or whether they want you to send sort of parts and like sections at a time, because different people have different preferences. I think, like personally, I think it's probably good to try and send it in sections, which again, I didn't. And what happens when you don't is that you sort of get lots and lots of comments on the first part, then you kind of get some comments on the middle part, and then at the end it might just say like, good. And you kind of hope that you're still saying relevant things and they've still kept reading it. So if you can talk to them early, work out your timelines and send it to them in sections. That process takes a while, and you go back and repeat and you rewrite and redraft, and you get more feedback. And then at the end, you do all your formatting, check that you're ticking all the boxes of like whatever font you need to be using, that you've got your table of contents and your abbreviations. With that, I'd recommend just like looking at some other people's lit reviews. So usually on Moodle, there's a whole bunch that are listed, and just have a look at them and see what format different people have used, see what you like and what you think is appropriate for your study. And because there is a tiny bit of creative license in science where you are allowed to sort of make it a little bit your own. And then you'll submit it, and it'll be the first major milestone of BMSI year, so congratulations. And you'll have a lot of coffees along the way, or teas, or hot chocolates if you don't drink coffee. So with clinical projects, so when we talk about clinical projects, we talk about trials, so like randomised or non-randomised trials, and cohort studies, which are what a lot of people who do BMSIs who do clinical projects end up doing. And usually those projects are retrospective trials. Can I have a show of hands who knows that they're doing a clinical trial or clinical project? Kind of few. Can I have a show of hands who doesn't really know what type of study their project is? Because we had a workshop at the Alfred like about a month in, and Danny Liu, who's a statistician there, gave a really great tune, and then he was like, I'm going to go through each type of study and we got to the end of the tube, and everyone sort of realised that they didn't actually know what type of study they were doing. So it's a good thing to try and make sure you clarify. So in terms of clinical projects, I guess my couple of tips are make sure you get your ethics in early. If you haven't got them in, try and get them in soon. Inevitably, ethics will always send it back, asking you to make amendments or justify things. So don't worry about sort of, like, I wouldn't put off submitting it because you don't think it's perfect, because they're going to send it back asking questions anyway. So try and send it early. Often also, if you're doing like a clinical project, or especially if you're doing a trial like I was that involves people, it needs to go to the ethics committee, which often only sits like once a month, and those dates are actually on the website usually. So make sure that if you still haven't got your ethics through, make sure you do check those dates and look at realistically when you get it back, because it's usually quite like a time lag between submitting it, having them reviewed on the committee, and then sending it back. If you're only making amendments, usually there's only about 2 weeks, but for your main ethics, make sure that's sort of sorted. In terms of power calculations, do a power calculation early as well. So clinical trials, other clinical projects where they ask you like, why did you pick this number of people? It's actually a really common question that they ask during oral presentations, is like, why did you have 30 patients in your trial? And so if you've done a power calculation, that will justify your study, and it also not only does justify it, but hopefully it also helps you kind of determine how feasible your study needs to be. So when we did the power calculation for my study, I needed 75 patients in each arm, so 150 patients plus 10% dropout, so like 174, which we made targets, but then more people dropped out and there were other issues in the trial. So I definitely recommend overshooting your power calculation as much as you can within the time frame, which leads on to talk about time frames, which when you're planning your time frames, give yourself a lot of leeway for every single part, because everything takes longer than you think it will. Like the researching takes longer, the writing takes longer, the recruiting takes longer, doing the stats takes longer. You sort of, as you go along the year, you kind of like, you'll have a point where you're like, I don't really know what I'm doing. And then you have a point where you'll be like, I have a plan, like this is great, I'm going to do it. And then as you go, you'll realize that there's so many things that you don't know along the way, and everything's taking a lot longer. So give yourself a lot of time to do things. And I'm sure that applies to science projects too. So my top tips, which I think have already sort of been covered, are like definitely use a referencing software. So I used EndNote as well. And reference as you go, which has been said a few times, but it's worth repeating because it just is not really feasible to leave it to the end to reference. So make sure you reference as you go. Keep notes. So this was one of the pieces of feedback I got from my lit review, was that I didn't really talk much about the search strategy within my lit review. And I sort of thought, oh, I probably don't need to because I'm not doing a systematic review. But I think it's probably still good to talk about it. So like make notes of including about how you did your search study, so what key terms you used, which databases you searched, and include those in your lit review. That was one of the pieces of feedback I got. And like I said before, start early and send it to your supervisor in sections. And then finally, this is perhaps one of the most important things, like for me, is like ask yourself a couple of questions. So when you've written a paragraph, a section, your whole lit review, just ask yourself, does it make sense? Because a lot of the time you kind of get like because you've done so much reading and you do so much writing, you get really into it and you're like writing and like you're like, so my project, like I told you, was on obesity. And I was like reading all these papers that included things like the genes that were first discovered that are thought to implement in obesity, everything from that until like green tea diets and like whether they have a therapeutic effect. And I wanted to include all of that in my lit review, and I started writing in, and then it just sort of went on this tangent, and I got to the stage where I was like, this doesn't really make sense. Like, this is not relevant to my trial. Like, what I'm just trying to say is that obesity is a complex disease that lots of things have been tried for that we're not very good at managing. So I don't need to talk a lot about the kind of different theories for adaptation and genes and why like people are more obese today than they were 100 years ago. So make sure like you stop and ask yourself, is what I'm writing making sense? Also ask yourself, could a diagram help to explain this or not? So sometimes if you do want to summarize some of that background information and you want to say, oh, there are lots of different factors that might impact on this disease, can you make, even yourself, if you can't find an appropriate one in a study, can you yourself make a little diagram or figure that summarizes those risk factors or those factors that combined, and put that into your lit review to help it just make a bit more sense. And then finally, is it clear how my project is relevant? Like, it's fantastic to write a really comprehensive piece about research in your field, but if it doesn't relate directly to your project, then whoever's reading it, your marker will get to the end and they'll be like, but like, what was the point? Like, why did you tell me all these things? So it needs to make sense, and then at the end, it needs to be clear how your project is relevant. And I think Ben covered that really well in his pyramid, like hourglass model. So there are a couple of things I wanted to show you with EndNote. So one of them is when you import or export like the whole search into EndNote, and the other is to use the groups within EndNote, okay? So, and again, give yourself time to reference. So when you export a search, basically, you do your search, you put in your key terms, and you have like, at the end, some results. So this is a search that I did for you guys at like midnight last night, where I searched sleep deprivation and medical students, and then had those results. And then what you can do from those results is, like, as well as going through each paper, is to actually, it's like not working, but what you can actually do is go on to export that entire search. Sorry, it's frozen. But
Yeah, it's frozen.
yeah,
Just keep
that's
going.
right. So basically, when you use it, you get your 55 results, and you can actually export that entire search into EndNote. And then what I recommend doing from then is actually keeping folders within EndNote for each database. So that's something that, again, I didn't do for my lit review, but I did do it later on in the year when I was helping my supervisor with a systematic review, and it was a really good system, and so I really recommend it. So basically, you can search your key terms, export the entire search, and keep those studies together in the same folder within EndNote. And if we can't get it working, like, hopefully you guys will be sent the slides anyway, and it's like I've got instructions in the slides that step through. So, like, I would recommend doing that. In terms of making groups within EndNote, initially I tried to do what Ben suggested and like pick topics and kind of keep my studies into topics. I found that for my trial that didn't work very well. Okay, we're back. So yeah, so you do your search, you have all your results that come out, and you can export your entire search, so all 55 results. And then when you save that file and open it into EndNote, it will open all 55 references, which saves you some time rather than going through each reference individually, putting it into PubMed, and then trying to download it. And if you are doing a systematic review, that's the way to do it. So what I was talking about before was when you make groups. So I tried to make groups that were kind of in topics, and I found that with my project, it didn't really work super well because there was, like, obesity is kind of just to be a topic, and I wasn't sure what I was trying to separate it into. So yeah, what I suggest instead is to actually save your searches via the database, which helps you then when you're making, if you're making like figures about how you did your search, and then you can save And then from there, those groups, you can actually further sort them into the ones you actually want to include in your lit review and the ones you've excluded or aren't relevant. And make sure that all your articles are there kind of for easy access for when you do want to go back and reference. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Yeah? So NO has a function that you can actually sort duplicates. So I don't have it here, but yeah, if you sorry? So when you sort the duplicates, what it does is it shows you, like, you have to actually, it identifies the duplicates, but then you have to manually actually go through like each duplicate. So when you do that, like usually there might be like a little bit of difference and you just need to know which one it comes up in. It's not a huge issue, because usually if you are doing systematic review, you'll say like in your figure that you did all these searches, you had like this number of results from each search, and then you removed this number of duplicates in total and had this number of results left, and it doesn't really matter too much about which database you file it under, because that's not really the point of the search. But yeah, so good question. And that also is helpful for sometimes if you've accidentally imported a reference in a few times, because like a few different people have told you to read it, or it has come up a few times in different searches and you haven't realized that you've got it in your library already. So yeah, so you can either put a reference into a group by right-clicking on the actual reference and then adding it into a group, which you can create, or you can right-click on the groups function and make a new group and then drag and drop your references into that group. So those are my tips on EndNote. A couple of general tips for BMSI year. Know your own timelines. Really important, because everyone's doing different projects. And just like some people will have time off at have downtime at different parts of the year. Often after lit review is the time that people have a little bit of downtime, but just know your own timelines for, like, if you're doing a clinical project when you're recruiting, that will be busy. When you're doing your stats, that will be busy. Have all that in mind early. I think it's a really good opportunity just to meet some new people. Like when you're in medicine, you tend to meet a lot of people who are in medicine. And it's nice sometimes when you're doing something a little bit different to meet and just get to know the people that work in your office or in your research lab, and have like just a 9-to-5 office job, and it makes you realize that your life is really different from kind of a normal person's life out there. It's full life outside medicine. So a lot of people say BMSI is like a quiet year. For me personally, it wasn't. It was a very busy year, but I still recommend trying to do other things outside, because it's always good to have balance, and if you can get some travel in or like work a part-time job. Research, I think, can be quite, I guess, like emotionally draining, because I find it a very, very inefficient process a lot of the time. You spend a lot of time not really knowing what you're doing, or doing things which at the end were not significant or didn't really amount to much. And so I think it's really important to have downtime away from that, so you don't like get too stressed about that throughout the year, because like a lot of med students, you're used to like you're studying and like you know all the things, and then you do your exams and you get the answers right. And research isn't like that. So it's good to have balance, like generally in your life. Help with that. Be proud of your work. I say this because it is research. A lot of people will, I guess, like a lot of people really support you, which is fantastic. But there's always going to also be people who don't believe in your study, or don't think what you're doing is important, or don't think that it's relevant, or don't think you should have funding. Or you'll have, like, there'll be people that, like, when they read your work, they disagree with what you've said, or they don't think that you've written it very well. And I think, like, it's really good to have feedback. It's really good to take all that on board. But at the same time, you need to be proud of the work that you've done. And you need to be confident that you have put the effort in, and that you have made the most of your year, and that you've learned things. Even if your project didn't go the way you wanted to, like mine, like there were lots and lots of hiccups along the way. But I think you just need to be proud of your work, so that when you do get to the end of the year, you have that sense of achievement and accomplishment that you have put all the effort in and done the best that you could have. And the other thing is just seize the day, so enjoy it. I think it is a really great year. You learn lots and it's lots of fun. So yeah, just enjoy the year as well. So that was all my tips and tricks. Does anyone have any questions? No. Cool, thanks guys.
So I'll just quickly follow that up. So, you know what Tiffany finished off with there about people having different opinions about the importance and everything else. That's really common in research. Now, I said in that first Foundation Week presentation that research isn't black and white. So really important to remember that. The reason you're doing the research is to start to fill in those missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. Okay, and different people will have different opinions. Different people will say, oh, you should use a different stats, you should have done it this way, or you should have done it that way, maybe you should use this. Just remember there is no perfect experiment, and you have to choose. Your supervisor will aim to choose a design that's feasible for you within the confines of an honours year and within the financial limitations that they have, the ethical limitations that they have, etc. But different people have different opinions in the end. And some will express those opinions more forcefully than others. Yeah, and in the end, you have to justify your project. So you have to stand up for the way that you're doing it. Okay? Any more questions before the end? I think you saw some couple of really beautiful presentations there from these guys. And I think the way, you saw that Ben was popping things up, I was saying, use animations to your advantage so that things would pop up as he was going through his slide to keep your attention focused on exactly what he wanted your attention to be focused on. I'll give you an example of using animations to not very good effect. I tell this one every year because it still makes me laugh. Quite a few years ago now, I remember watching an honours student presentation, and this honours student was working on ejaculation. And so we're in the physiology department, and so he was giving his presentation about ejaculation, and he had an inbuilt auto animation to each slide where there's like a little star appeared on one side of the slide and shot off across the other slide in all different directions. And on every single slide, this little thing would ejaculate across the slide. And the audience was in hysterics. And so I had tears running down my face. We got to the end of the presentation and still, we'd quieten down after one or two slides. Everybody would damble and giggling, and then one person would start giggling and the entire audience would erupt in laughter. Hilarious. But we got to the end and we didn't actually know what he talked about. We were so busy laughing. Yeah, so use animations to good effect. Be careful about overusing animations to bad effect. Okay? Steph, do you want to say anything more? So good luck. I mean, there's lots of, everybody's literature review is different. Just really speak to your supervisor a lot. Don't wait till you think it's perfect. Really important that you don't wait till you think it's perfect. It's never going to be perfect. We revise things. We're used to revising things 1,000 times. Yeah, so don't wait till it's perfect. Just give it to your supervisor. Ask for some feedback. Make sure that you're on the right direction. As Tiffany was saying, send it off in chunks if you can, ideally, rather than waiting until you get to until you get all the way to the end. And if your supervisor is saying, oh, half of it was a complete waste of space. Yeah? Okay? Good luck.